In Lincolnshire, long, long ago, the land was covered with water. There were great pools of black water. There were narrow streams of green water. There were squishy, muddy ditches of brown, smelly water. And when the moon, the kindly moon, was shining bright, it was safe for travellers to walk in the marshes by night. But when there was no moon, why then the bad things would come out. The quicks and the witches, the boggles and the boggarts, and they would poke and prod and push unwary travellers so that they tripped and fell into the great pools of black water, the narrow streams of green water, the squishy, muddy ditches of brown, smelly water. And when the moon, the kindly moon, heard that this was happening, she decided to go and see for herself. So she took a cloak and covered her shining brightness and stepped down from the sky and walked among the marshes. As she was walking, her cloak caught on a branch and she became stuck. She struggled, trying to free herself, but to no avail. As she was struggling, the moon heard someone crying out in fear. She looked in horror and noticed that a man was being pushed and poked and prodded by the quicks and the witches, the boggles and the boggarts, closer and closer to the deepest, darkest pool in the marsh. The moon was desperate to help. She pulled and pulled on the branch that held her, and as she pulled, the hood fell back, and the shining brightness of her hair flooded the marsh with moonlight. In the moonlight, the traveller could see the path, and he ran from the marsh with a cry of relief, while the quicks and the witches, the boggles and the boggarts, grumbled and moaned and scurried back to their holes in the ground. But the moon was still stuck. She continued to struggle to try to free herself, and as she struggled, her hood fell back and covered her hair, and the marsh was dark once more. But in the darkness, out came the bad things, the quicks and the witches, the boggles and the boggarts, and this time it was the moon, the kindly moon, that they poked and prodded and pushed, and poked and prodded and pushed, right into the deepest, darkest pool in the marsh, and they pushed her right to the bottom, and they covered her with a stone, and only a tiddy glimmer of light, shining up through the water, showed she was there at all. That night the people looked up at the moonless sky and asked, "Where's the moon?" And in the nights that followed, the quicks and the witches and the boggles and the boggarts were not the only creatures living in the marsh in those days. There was also the tiddyman, the little man. Sometimes he helped the people of the marsh when they asked him, and when he was in a good mood. So the people went to the tiddyman and they said, "We've lost the moon and we can't go out at night because of the quicks and the witches and the boggles and the boggarts." Tiddyman never said much, but he agreed to help, and together the tiddyman and the people began to search for the moon. They looked in all the great pools of black water, but they couldn't find her. Days passed, and they searched in all the narrow streams of green water, but they couldn't find her. Weeks passed, and they searched in all the squishy, muddy ditches of brown, smelly water, but they couldn't find her. And then at last, a man remembered a great shining light at the very heart of the marsh and told the Tiddyman. Tiddyman and the people went to look, and they peered down into the deepest, darkest pool of the marsh, and there they saw a tiddy glimmer of light shining up through the water. They fetched ropes, and they tied them round the great stone at the bottom of the pool, and they started to pull. They pulled and they pulled, though the quicks and the witches screamed at them. They pulled and they pulled, though the boggles and the boggarts poked at them. They pulled and they pulled, nearly all night long, until at last the stone moved. There was a splash and a flash of light, and there was the moon, the kindly moon shining down at them. Tiddyman, who never said much, took off his hat and waved at the moon. And some people say, though I don't know if it's true, that the moon waved back and smiled. One use for a minute timer at the end of a story is to allow for a minute's silence. Silence can provoke anxiety, and one way to contain that anxiety is to be able to see what a minute looks like. And I've had very little children, as well as much older, sit absorbed, watching the sand, not noticing that they're actually sitting in silence, and it lets the story sink in to their memories. One thing you can do following a story is to ask the children what strengths that they could see in that story. No story is ever about one thing or one character strength or virtue. Here are some of the ones children have said that they could see in this story. They've said they could see hope. They've said they could see persistence. They've said they could see love. They've said they could see teamwork. If you tell this story to your children, to your young people, they may well see others too. I hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you for listening.